The sky was burning. Flames covered the alien queen's ship as it fell from the clouds. Sparks flew inside. The alarms screamed. The controls were dead. She tried to move, but pain shot through her body. Blood dripped from her side. The attack had come fast. Too fast. One moment, she was sitting on her throne. The next, her own people had turned against her. Betrayed. Hunted. Now she was crashing toward an unknown planet, her ship breaking apart around her. She clenched her teeth. She was not going to die like this. With the last of her strength, she slammed her hand on the emergency pod button. A metal door opened behind her. The escape pod, her only chance. Boom! A massive explosion rocked the ship. The force threw her against the wall. Darkness filled her vision. No, she had to move, had to survive. She crawled toward the pod, her fingers gripping the floor. Another explosion. The ship tilted sideways. She fell inside just as the doors sealed shut. A second later, the pod shot out into the sky. The Queen gasped as the pod crashed through the planet's atmosphere. Fire surrounded her again, but this time, the pod held strong. She gripped the seat tightly as it spun through the air. Then, impact. The pod slammed into the ground with a loud crash. Dust and rocks flew everywhere. The metal groaned. The Queen's body jerked forward. Her vision blurred. For a moment, everything was silent. She forced her eyes open. The pod's door was half broken. She pushed it with her shoulder, groaning as pain stabbed through her ribs. The door creaked, then finally gave way. Fresh air hit her face. She stumbled out and looked around. A jungle. Tall trees stretched high into the sky, their branches thick with green leaves. Strange sounds echoed in the air. Chirps, growls, rustling. The ground was soft beneath her feet, covered in thick roots and wild plants. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and rain. The Queen took a shaky breath. She was alive, but she was not safe. She touched her side. Her suit was torn. Blood leaked through the fabric. She had to find shelter. She had to. A sharp crack came from the trees. She froze. Something was watching her. She turned her head slowly. The jungle was dense, shadows moving between the trees. But she could feel it. Eyes on her. Her heart pounded. Was it an animal? A hunter? One of her enemies? She reached for the small blade on her belt. Her fingers wrapped around the handle. Weak, but ready. Another sound. Closer this time. Leaves rustled. A shape moved in the shadows. Then, he stepped out. A man. Tall. Broad shoulders. Scared arms. His body covered in animal skins. His face was hard. Eyes sharp like a predator. He held a long wooden spear in one hand, its tip carved to a deadly point. The Queen's breath caught in her throat. A human. She had seen humans before. Weak creatures. Small. Frail. But this one looked different. Strong. Dangerous. The man did not move. He only stared at her, his expression unreadable. The Queen tightened her grip on her blade. She did not know if he was friend or foe. She could not afford to trust. Not now. Not after everything. Then, the jungle stirred again. More movement, not from the man. From behind her. She turned fast, too fast. Pain shot through her body, making her stumble. Footsteps. Heavy. Too heavy to be animals. Her enemies had found her. A group of armored figures stepped out from the trees. Their helmets gleamed in the dim light. They raised their weapons, aiming straight at her. The Queen clenched her jaw. She was too weak to fight, too hurt to run. The leader of the assassins pointed his blaster at her chest. "This is the end, Your Highness," he sneered. The Queen took a deep breath. If this was the end, she would face it standing. But then, a blur of motion. The human moved. Fast. Before the assassin could pull the trigger, the man lunged. His spear shot forward. It struck the assassin's throat. piercing through his armor like paper. Blood sprayed as the body dropped. The jungle fell silent. For a second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The assassins turned their weapons toward the human. They fired, but he was already gone. He rolled into the shadows, disappearing between the trees. A second later, he struck again, his spear slicing through another enemy's chest. One by one, they fell. The queen could only watch in shock. Her people had advanced weapons, armor, training. This man had nothing but a spear and his own strength. And yet, he was winning. The last assassin turned to run. The human didn't let him. He grabbed the enemy from behind, twisting his neck with a sharp crack. The body slumped to the ground. Silence. The queen felt her heart racing. The human stood there, breathing hard, his spear dripping with blood. He turned to her. Their eyes met. The queen had always thought humans were weak. Now, she wasn't so sure. The jungle was quiet. Too quiet. The alien queen stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The battle was over, but her mind could not accept what she had just seen. A single human, alone, with only a spear, and he had killed all of them. She looked down at the bodies of the assassins. Some lay with their throats cut, others with spears through their hearts. Blood darkened the forest floor. The human had done this. She turned her gaze back to him. He was standing a few steps away, watching her. His body was covered in dirt and sweat. His arms were tense, muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike again. His eyes were sharp, focused. The queen tightened her grip on her blade. She did not understand. Humans were weak in space. They could not match her people's strength or speed. They were soft, fragile. But this one was different. The human took a step closer. The queen tensed, shifting her stance. If he attacked, she would fight. She was injured, weak, but she would not die without a fight. The man did not attack. Instead, he pointed at her side, where blood was still leaking from her wound. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes held something she could not name. Concern. The queen blinked. Why would a primitive care if she was hurt? He took another step, then crouched. He picked up a handful of leaves from the forest floor, crushed them between his fingers, and rubbed them on his own arm. Then he pointed at her wound again. The queen hesitated. Was he trying to help her? She did not trust him. Not yet, but she was losing blood, and she had no supplies. Her advanced healing suit was broken. She would not last long without aid. Slowly, she nodded. The human moved closer. His hands were rough, scared from battles she could not imagine. He worked in silence, pressing the crushed leaves against her wound. The sting was sharp, but then, relief. She watched him closely. His movements were careful, skilled. He knew exactly what he was doing. Who was this man? She had seen many warriors in her life, trained killers, elite soldiers. But none of them moved like this. He was not just strong. He was something else, something more. A survivor, a hunter. The human finished his work and stepped back. His dark eyes met hers. He said nothing, but she understood. He had saved her life. The queen exhaled slowly. For the first time since crashing on this planet, she did not feel like prey. Night fell over the jungle. The queen sat near a small fire, her body still weak. The human sat across from her, sharpening his spear with a sharp stone. Sparks flickered in the dim light. She studied him carefully. He had no armor, no weapons except the ones he made himself, no technology. And yet, he had defeated highly trained assassins without a single wound on his body. She wanted to ask him many things. Where had he come from? How had he survived in this wild place? But there was one problem. They did not share a language. She tried speaking to him. He only tilted his head. She pointed at herself. Queen. The man watched her. Then he pointed at her. Keen. She frowned. Queen. Keen. She sighed. Close enough. Then she pointed at him, raised an eyebrow. The human paused for a moment. Then he tapped his chest. Joran. Joran. A name. So he was not just a wild beast. He had an identity. A purpose. The queen nodded. She pointed at him again. Joran. A small flicker of something crossed his face. A shadow of a smile. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. Hours passed. The queen tried to rest, but her mind was restless. She glanced at Joran. He was awake, sitting still, listening to the sounds of the night. He was watching, protecting. A thought came to her mind. Did he live alone? Were there others like him? Or was he the last of his kind? She did not know. But one thing was clear. Joran was no ordinary human. And tomorrow, she would learn just how dangerous he truly was. The jungle was alive. Leaves rustled. Strange creatures howled in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rain. The alien queen stood near the dying fire, her body still weak, but her mind sharp. She watched Joran. The human moved silently, his spear resting in his hand. His eyes scanned the jungle, his body still as a statue. He was listening, waiting. For what? The queen frowned. She did not like being kept in the dark. She was a ruler, a warrior, and yet here she was, helpless on an unknown planet. Her enemies were still searching for her. If they found her again, she would not be so lucky. She needed answers. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. Joran. The human turned his head slightly, showing he was listening. She pointed at the jungle, then at herself. Where are we? Joran only blinked. He did not understand. The queen exhaled sharply. This was frustrating. She needed to find a way to communicate. She tried again. She pointed at the trees, then spread her hands wide. What is this place? Joran tilted his head, thinking. Then he tapped his chest. Home. The queen's eyes narrowed. This was his home. Impossible. No humans lived on this planet. At least none that she knew of. Her people had explored many worlds, but this place was not on any of their maps. So how had he survived here? Joran suddenly tensed. His head snapped toward the trees. His grip on his spear tightened. The queen felt her pulse quicken. She knew that look. It was the look of a hunter sensing danger. Something was coming. Joran moved first. Without a word, he grabbed the queen's arm and pulled her toward the trees. She almost stumbled but caught herself. He led her deeper into the jungle, moving fast but silent. The queen clenched her jaw. She did not like being dragged like this, but she trusted his instincts. If he sensed danger, she would not ignore it. They stopped behind a thick tree. Joran pressed a finger to his lips. The queen nodded. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, controlled. Not an animal. Her enemies. Her blood turned cold. The assassins had returned. Through the leaves, she saw them. 5 figures, covered in dark armor, moving carefully. They carried plasma rifles, scanning the jungle. Their leader had a device in his hand, a glowing screen flashing with symbols. They were tracking her. The queen's mind raced. She had no weapons. She was still weak. Even Joran, as skilled as he was, could not take all of them at once. But Joran was not afraid. He studied the assassins carefully. Then he moved. Like a shadow, he climbed the nearest tree, his movements swift and silent. He disappeared into the branches above. The queen's breath caught. What was he doing? The assassins stopped a few feet away. The signal is close, one of them said. The leader nodded. Spread out. She's near. They split into pairs, moving deeper into the jungle. That was a mistake. A shadow dropped from the trees. Joran struck fast. His spear plunged into the first assassin's throat. The body hit the ground before the others even noticed. The second assassin turned, too slow. Joran's hand shot forward, grabbing the enemy's helmet. With one sharp twist, the assassin's neck snapped. The queen's eyes widened. This man, he was not just strong. He was death itself. The remaining 3 assassins turned, raising their rifles. Joran vanished into the trees again. Panic spread through the soldiers. Where did he go? One shouted. Then, silence. A few heartbeats passed. Then a spear shot out from the darkness, hitting another assassin in the chest. He fell with a choking gasp. The last 2 enemies fired wildly into the trees. Joran was already behind them. He lunged, grabbing one by the shoulders and slamming him against a tree. The impact was brutal. Bones cracked. The assassin collapsed, unmoving. Only one remained. The queen saw fear in his eyes. Joran stepped forward. The assassin dropped his rifle and ran. Big mistake. Joran grabbed a fallen spear and hurled it. The weapon flew through the air, spinning like a deadly arrow. It struck the fleeing enemy in the back. He fell face first into the dirt. Dead. The jungle was silent again. Joran walked back toward the queen. His body was covered in blood, not his own. He picked up his spear, wiped the blade on his arm, and looked at her. The queen stared at him. She had fought in wars. She had seen death. But this was something else. This was a man who had mastered the hunt. A man who did not need armor, guns, or an army. A man who had just taken down 5 armed killers in under a minute. The queen swallowed hard. She had underestimated him. Joran nodded toward the trees, signaling for her to follow. The queen took one last look at the dead assassins. Then she followed the man who had just proven that, in this jungle, he was the true king. The jungle was darker now. The fire was gone. The trees stood tall like silent watchers. The queen followed Joran through the thick forest, her mind still spinning. She had seen warriors. She had seen killers. But Joran was different. He did not just fight. He hunted. And he won. Every time. The assassins had been well trained, armed, armored. They should have killed him easily. Instead, they had died. Joran walked ahead, his spear resting on his shoulder. His movements were calm, controlled, as if nothing had happened. The queen's fingers tightened into fists. She had been a fool. She had believed humans were weak, that they needed technology, weapons, and numbers to win wars. But here was a single man, alone in the wild, fighting without fear. And he had done more than survive. He had dominated. She swallowed hard. What was he? Joran suddenly stopped. The queen almost bumped into him. She frowned. What? He raised a hand, silencing her. His head tilted slightly, listening. The queen heard it a second later. A deep, low growl. Not human. Not alien. Something else. Joran turned his head slightly, whispering one word. Hunter. The queen stiffened. She had no idea what kind of creature lived here. But if Joran called it a hunter, it was dangerous. Her body tensed. Her wound still ached, but she reached for her broken blade. If they were attacked, she would not go down without a fight. Joran, however, did not reach for his spear. Instead, he crouched low, pressing his palm against the ground. He touched the dirt, the leaves, the roots. Then he took a slow breath, smelling the air. The queen's eyes widened. He was tracking it. Like an animal, like a beast. A chill ran down her spine. Joran pointed toward the trees and motioned for her to follow. They moved quietly, stepping over roots and leaves without making a sound. The queen watched him carefully, copying his movements. She did not know why she trusted him, but she did. Minutes passed. The jungle was silent. The growling had stopped. Then Joran slowed. He pointed ahead. The queen followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. A creature stood in the clearing. It was massive, its body covered in thick black fur. Its eyes glowed yellow in the darkness. Its claws were long, sharp, dripping with blood. The ground beneath it was littered with bones. The queen's heart pounded. She had fought deadly beasts before, but something about this one felt different. It was not just an animal. It was a killer. Joran slowly stepped forward. The queen grabbed his arm. "Are you insane?" she hissed. Joran simply glanced at her, then pointed at the creature. "Mine. Mine." He was not afraid. He was claiming it, as if it was nothing more than prey. The queen stared at him. This man, was he even human? The beast sniffed the air. Its ears twitched. Then, slowly, it turned its massive head toward them. Its lips curled back, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Joran exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Then he did something that made the queen's blood run cold. He stepped forward. Out of the shadows, into the open, the beast growled, lowering its body, preparing to strike. The queen's fingers tightened on her blade. If it attacked, they were dead. Joran, however, did not flinch. Instead, he grinned. A slow, dangerous grin. Then he roared. Loud, deep. Not a scream of fear. Not a cry for help. A challenge. The jungle seemed to shake from the sound. The beast hesitated. Its glowing eyes flickered. It did not understand. The queen did not understand either. But she saw something she had never seen before. For the first time, the hunter looked unsure. Joran did not wait. He moved. Fast. One moment, he was standing still. The next, he was a blur of motion. The queen barely saw the spear leave his hand. It struck the beast's leg. The creature howled, staggering back. But Joran was already there. He leaped onto its back, grabbing its thick fur. His legs wrapped around its neck, holding tight. The beast roared, thrashing wildly. But Joran held on. His fist slammed against its skull. Once, twice. The beast stumbled. Then, with terrifying strength, Joran grabbed its massive jaw. The queen's breath caught. No, he couldn't. Could he? With a savage growl, Joran twisted. A sickening crack filled the air. The beast's body went limp. Joran stood over the dead creature, breathing hard. Blood dripped from his fingers. His chest rose and fell with each breath. Then slowly he turned. His dark eyes met the queen's. And for the first time in her life, she felt afraid. This was no man. This was something else. Something terrifying. Something unstoppable. She had once believed humans were weak. Now, she knew the truth. They were monsters. And Joran was the worst of them all. The jungle was silent again. The massive beast lay dead, its body still warm. Blood soaked the ground beneath it. Joran stood over the corpse, breathing slowly. His muscles were tense, his eyes dark. He wiped his hands on his skin, smearing the blood away like it was nothing. The queen watched him carefully. Her heart was still racing. This man, he had killed a monster with his bare hands. He had broken its neck as if it were nothing more than a toy. She had seen warriors, assassins, and beasts, but never anything like this. Joran was something else. A force of nature, a predator among predators. And she was alone with him. Joran turned, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. The queen tensed but did not move. She refused to show fear. He studied her for a moment, then pointed at the dead beast. Food. The queen blinked. Was he planning to eat it? She stared at the massive corpse. It smelled foul, its fur matted with blood. But Joran did not seem to care. He crouched, pulling a sharp stone from his belt. With practiced skill, he began cutting into the creature's flesh. The queen hesitated. She had eaten many things in her lifetime, delicacies from across the galaxy. But this was raw, uncooked, primitive. Joran cut off a chunk of meat and tossed it onto a flat stone. He motioned for her to sit. She narrowed her eyes. "I do not eat raw flesh." Joran tilted his head. Then, without a word, he stood and walked away. The queen frowned. Was he leaving? No, he was gathering something. Moments later, he returned with dry leaves and small twigs. He set them in a pile, then pulled a small, rough stone from his pouch. The queen watched closely. He struck the stone against another rock. Sparks flew. Again. Again. A tiny flame flickered to life. The queen's breath caught. She had seen fire before, of course, but not like this. Not made by hand, with no tools, no technology, just pure skill. Joran fed the flame. Adding more wood, the fire grew stronger. Minutes later, the meat sizzled over the flames. The rich smell of roasted flesh filled the air. The queen's stomach growled. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain still. Joran glanced at her, smirking slightly. He knew she was hungry. The queen hated that. The meal was simple, but it was food. The queen ate carefully, keeping her eyes on Joran. He sat across from her, chewing his own portion, calm as ever. She studied him. He had no armor, no advanced weapons, no supplies, and yet he was the strongest being she had ever seen. She needed to know more. She pointed at him. "How long have you been here?" Joran frowned, thinking. Then he held up one hand. 5, she guessed. 5 months. He shook his head. Her stomach turned. 5 years. He nodded. The queen stared at him. 5 years. Alone. Surviving in this wild, deadly world. Most soldiers would have gone mad. Most warriors would have died. Joran had thrived. Her mind raced. How had he ended up here? Why was he alone? More importantly, if he had survived this long, why had he not escaped? She decided to ask something else. Were there others? Joran's jaw tightened. A shadow passed over his face. The queen saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Pain. Loss. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He stood up, grabbing his spear. "We leave." The queen wanted to ask more, but she knew he would not answer. Not yet. They moved through the jungle again. Joran walked ahead, silent as ever. The queen followed, her thoughts heavy. She did not know where they were going. She only knew one thing. Joran was more than a survivor. He was more than a warrior. He was something far greater. Something terrifying. And if her people ever learned the truth about him, they would fear him. Because Joran was not just strong. He was unstoppable. And he had nothing left to lose. The jungle was silent again. Only the sound of their footsteps pressed against the damp earth. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of trees and distant rain. Joran moved ahead, his spear resting against his shoulder. He walked with steady, calm steps, like a predator that knew nothing could challenge him. The queen followed, her mind restless. 5 years. He had survived 5 years alone in this wild place. She had seen many warriors, assassins and killers, but Joran was something else. He was not just strong. He was not just skilled. He was something unnatural, something terrifying. She needed to know more. But Joran was silent, and that silence was heavier than words. After hours of walking, Joran stopped. The queen almost bumped into him. He raised a hand. She stiffened. "What?" "Look," he whispered. She followed his gaze. Ahead, hidden between the trees, were ruins. Massive broken stone structures covered in vines. Walls cracked and shattered, the remains of a once great place. But what caught the queen's attention were the bodies. Old bones scattered across the ground. Skulls split open, armor rusted and broken. The queen felt a cold chill crawl up her spine. Joran walked forward. The queen hesitated, then followed. She crouched near a set of bones. Her fingers brushed against the cracked skull. It was human. Slowly, She turned to Joran. Who were they? He did not answer. But she saw it. That flicker of pain in his dark eyes. They were yours, she whispered. Joran nodded. The Queen's throat tightened. These were his people, his friends, his brothers. And they had all died here. Joran knelt beside a rusted helmet. His fingers ran over the surface, brushing away the dirt. The Queen saw his jaw tighten. His grip on the helmet was firm, his body still. Then softly, he spoke. They came for me. His voice was low, rough, filled with something the Queen could not place. Guilt, regret, pain. She swallowed hard. What happened? Joran closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were colder than before. The aliens came. They attacked our ship. His voice was calm, but the Queen could feel the rage beneath it. Some of us escaped. We crashed here. He gestured to the ruins. We made this place our home. We fought. We survived. He looked at the broken weapons, the shattered bones. But one by one, they died. The Queen felt something heavy settle in her chest. Joran had not always been alone. He had lived with his people. He had fought beside them. And then, he had watched them die. You were the last, she said quietly. Joran nodded. The Queen exhaled. Now she understood. Joran was not just a survivor. He was not just a warrior. He was a ghost. A man who had lost everything. A man with nothing left to fear. Nothing left to lose. And that made him more dangerous than any weapon. Joran stood up. His fingers curled into fists. He looked at the ruins one last time, then turned away. We go, he said. The Queen hesitated. You're just leaving. Joran did not answer. The Queen glanced at the bones, at the ruined helmets, at the shattered armor. Then she followed him. She did not look back. But the ghosts did, watching, waiting. And as they walked away, the Queen knew one thing. If Joran ever had his revenge, it would be brutal. Because this was not just about survival anymore. This was personal. And no one in the galaxy could stop him. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, but the Queen's mind was trapped in the past. Joran's past. She could still see the ruins, the broken helmets, the scattered bones. His people had come for him, fought for him, and died for him. And yet, he still stood, a single survivor, a ghost. The Queen had always thought humans were weak, but now, as she walked behind this man, she realized the truth. They were something far worse. They refused to die. Joran moved forward, silent and focused. His eyes scanned the jungle ahead, always watching, always prepared. The Queen's wound still ached, but she forced herself to keep up. She had many questions, but Joran was not a man who spoke without reason. So she stayed quiet. For now. Hours passed. The sky above darkened. The wind carried the scent of rain. Joran stopped near a large tree. He pressed his palm against the bark, feeling it, listening. Then he nodded. Here. The Queen frowned. Here, what? Joran did not answer. He knelt down, grabbing a sharp rock. He began digging. The Queen crossed her arms. You're not going to tell me, are you? Joran smirked slightly. The Queen sighed but crouched beside him, helping move the dirt. Minutes passed. Then, clang. The Queen froze. Joran kept digging, faster now. He cleared the dirt away, revealing something metal beneath. A small hatch. The Queen's eyes widened. What is this? Joran did not answer. He grabbed the edge of the hatch and pulled. The rusted metal groaned. But then, it opened. A dark hole stretched beneath them. A tunnel. The Queen looked at Joran. You knew this was here. Joran nodded. I built it. The Queen's breath caught. Joran had not just survived on this planet. He had prepared. They climbed down. The tunnel was dark, But Joran moved like he knew every step. The queen followed, her heart pounding. Then, Joran lit a torch. The queen's eyes widened. Weapons, supplies, food, tools, armor. This was no simple shelter. This was a war camp. She turned to Joran. "You've been waiting." Joran's face was calm, but his eyes burned. "I knew they would come back," he said. The queen shivered. "Who?" Joran's fingers tightened around his spear. "The ones who left me here." The queen's mind raced. Joran had not been left here by accident. Someone had betrayed him, and he had been waiting. For years. Waiting for his chance. Waiting for revenge. The queen swallowed hard. "You think they'll return?" Joran's jaw tightened. "They always do." There was no doubt in his voice. No hesitation. The queen exhaled. She had once thought Joran was just a survivor. Now she saw the truth. He was a hunter. And soon, his prey would return.